Sometimes life pushes you so far down, you forget what hope even feels like. Mark Ellison knew that feeling well at 49. He'd lost his job, his apartment, and nearly his will to keep fighting. Standing in front of Storage Unit 247 with 100 borrowed dollars, this was his last chance. He expected nothing, maybe some old furniture he could sell, a few boxes of junk. Instead, he found hand-carved stone tablets wrapped in yellowed linen, tucked inside dusty cardboard boxes that had sat forgotten for decades. Experts would later confirm they were authentic, ancient artifacts worth millions. How does someone at rock bottom stumble upon something like this? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something special lined up for you. 6 months earlier, Mark Ellison's life looked different. Not glamorous, not exciting, but stable, predictable. At 49, he'd made peace with that. He worked as a cataloger at the Riverside County Museum, a mid-level position that paid enough to cover rent on a modest one-bedroom apartment, keep his 12-year-old sedan running, and occasionally treat himself to dinner at the Italian place down the street. The museum wasn't prestigious. Most people in town didn't even know it existed, tucked away in a converted warehouse on the industrial side of the city. But Mark loved it. He'd spent the last 15 years there, surrounded by artifacts and documents that whispered stories from the past. His desk sat in a corner of the climate-controlled archive room, where he meticulously entered object descriptions into the digital database, cross-referenced acquisition dates, and occasionally got to handle pieces that made his fingers tingle with reverence. History had always been his passion. Back in college, he'd studied archaeology with dreams of fieldwork in distant countries, of making discoveries that would rewrite textbooks. But life had other plans. He'd married young, had a son, and suddenly responsibilities mattered more than dreams. The degree in archaeology became a cataloging job. The adventures became database entries. He told himself it was enough. His ex-wife, Karen, had left 8 years ago. She'd wanted more money, more excitement, more everything. Mark couldn't blame her, not really. He'd become comfortable in his routines, content with his quiet life among dusty artifacts. She'd moved to Phoenix with a pharmaceutical sales rep who drove a BMW and took her to resort weekends. They'd been cordial through the divorce, splitting everything down the middle. Their son Jake had been 19 then, already in college, spared the worst of it. Jake was 27 now, working as a software engineer in San Diego, making more money than Mark ever had. They talked every few weeks, brief calls where Jake updated him on work projects Mark didn't quite understand, and Mark asked questions that probably sounded irrelevant to a young man building his career. There was love there, but also distance. Not hostility, just the natural drift that happens when lives move in different directions. Mark had been fine with all of it, fine with his solitary dinners, fine with his weekend routine of coffee, crossword puzzles, and old movies, fine with being ordinary. Then came the Tuesday morning meeting in March. The museum's director, a perpetually anxious woman named Mrs. Landry, had gathered the entire staff, all 9 of them, in the cramped conference room. Her hands had trembled as she'd explained the situation. Funding cuts, budget shortfalls. The board had made difficult decisions. 4 positions were being eliminated, effective in 30 days. Mark's name was on the list. Mrs. Landry had apologized, said something about seniority not being enough when the entire institution was struggling. She'd mentioned recommendation letters, assistance with job searches. Mark had nodded, numb, while his colleague Dennis squeezed his shoulder sympathetically. 30 days to find new employment. At 49, with a specialized skill set and a job market that seemed to prefer people half his age, he'd tried. He'd sent out dozens of applications to museums, universities, historical societies. Most didn't respond. The few who did sent polite rejections. "We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Your qualifications are impressive, but we're looking for someone with more recent technological experience. One email had actually thanked him for his interest and suggested he might consider volunteer opportunities to stay involved in the Spurs field. Volunteer, as if passion paid rent. His savings disappeared faster than he'd anticipated. Unemployment benefits helped, but not enough. The landlord had been understanding at first, then firm, then unforgiving. 3 months behind on rent meant eviction papers taped to his door. Mark had packed his life into boxes, books mostly, some clothes, a few photographs, everything else he'd sold or donated. The furniture went to a second-hand shop for almost nothing. He'd moved into a weekly rate motel on the edge of town, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and neighbors he tried not to make eye contact with. Pride kept him from calling Jake. His son was building a life, shouldn't have to worry about his father's failures. Pride kept him from reaching out to Karen, from admitting that maybe she'd been right to want more than what he'd offered. Pride kept him isolated in that motel room, watching his bank account dwindle towards zero. That's when Dennis had mentioned the storage unit auctions. They'd met for coffee, Dennis's treat, which stung more than Mark wanted to admit. Dennis still worked at the museum, had survived the cuts. He'd meant well, asking how Mark was doing, offering to help with job leads. The conversation had drifted to side hustles, ways to make extra money. "My cousin does those storage unit auctions," Dennis had said, stirring cream into his coffee. "You know, when people abandon their units and don't pay, the facilities auction off the contents. Sometimes there's good stuff, furniture, electronics, tools. You can resell it." Mark had listened politely, thinking it sounded desperate, gambling on other people's abandoned possessions. "There's one this Saturday," Dennis had continued. "Out near the industrial park, units go for anywhere from $50 to a few hundred, depending on what's visible. With your eye for artifacts and antiques, you might spot something valuable that others miss." The suggestion had sat with Mark for 3 days. He'd counted and recounted the cash he had left. $217. That was it. That was all that stood between him and complete destitution. On Friday evening, he'd swallowed his pride and called Dennis. Could he borrow $100? Just until he got back on his feet. Dennis had agreed immediately, no questions asked, meeting him the next morning outside the storage facility with 5 crisp $20 bills. "Good luck, Mark," Dennis had said. "I believe in you." Now Mark stood among the crowd of about 30 people gathered in the morning heat outside Premier Storage Solutions. The facility sprawled across several acres, rows upon rows of identical orange doors with white numbers. The crowd was diverse, older men who looked like they did this regularly, younger couples probably looking for furniture bargains, a few serious-faced individuals who kept to themselves and studied every unit with calculating eyes. Mark felt out of place. He'd dressed in his most presentable clothes, khakis that needed pressing, and a button-down shirt with a small stain he'd tried to scrub out. Everyone else seemed comfortable here, casual, like they knew what they were doing. The auctioneer, a weathered man named Floyd, explained the rules. They'd walk unit to unit. Each door would be opened, but no one could enter or touch anything. You bid on what you see. All sales final. Cash only. Remove your items within 48 hours or face additional fees. Mark's hands shook slightly as he gripped the $100 in his pocket. The first unit went for $250. Furniture, boxes, what looked like sports equipment. The second went for $75, mostly clothes and household items. Mark didn't bid on either. He was studying, watching, trying to understand the rhythm of this strange commerce. Unit 247 came up around mid-morning. Floyd rolled up the door with theatrical flair, revealing a space about 10 feet by 10 feet, packed floor to ceiling with boxes, furniture draped in old sheets, and miscellaneous items that had clearly sat untouched for years. Dust motes danced in the light. The smell of old cardboard and neglect wafted out. "All right, folks, what am I bid?" Floyd's voice carried across the crowd. Mark studied the contents. Nothing, obviously valuable. Old furniture that looked cheap, even under the sheets. Cardboard boxes with faded labels, some plastic storage bins, a floor lamp with a torn shade, a small table with ceramic figurines, tourist shop quality, probably. $50, someone called out. 50, got 50. Who'll give me 75? Mark looked closer. One of the ceramic pieces caught his eye, a small jaguar, maybe 6 inches tall. Even from this distance, even through the dust, something about the detail work seemed unusual. The proportions were off for a mass-produced tourist item. The glaze looked hand-applied, uneven in a way that suggested age rather than poor manufacturing. 75. Another voice. Mark's heart rate picked up. Was he seeing what he wanted to see, creating value out of desperation? 75. Got 75. Do I hear 100? His hand went up before he could second-guess himself. 100. Got 100 from the gentleman in blue. Do I hear 125? Silence. The crowd had moved on mentally, already eyeing the next unit. 100, going once, going twice. Floyd's gavel came down. Sold to bidder 73. Mark's entire body trembled as he handed over Dennis's $100 to the cashier. He received a receipt, a padlock key, and 48 hours to empty Unit 247. Standing alone before the open unit after the crowd had moved on, Mark stared at what he'd just bought, a storage space full of someone else's abandoned life. His last $100 spent on what was probably junk. He reached for the ceramic jaguar, lifted it carefully. The weight felt right. The craftsmanship, even under dust and grime, showed artistry. His trained eye noticed the detail in the carved features, the intentional asymmetry that marked handwork rather than mold casting. Maybe it was something, maybe it was nothing, but standing there with the figurine in his hands, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in months, a spark of purpose, a whisper of possibility. He began to load boxes into his car, working methodically despite the heat and his growing exhaustion. He had 48 hours and a motel room that barely fit him, much less all this. But he also had hope, fragile and uncertain as it was. And sometimes, that's enough to start with. Mark spent the rest of Saturday ferrying boxes from the storage unit to his motel room. The ancient sedan groaned under the weight of each load, and by evening his small room had transformed into a maze of cardboard and plastic bins. He'd managed to retrieve everything that seemed remotely valuable, leaving behind only broken furniture and moth-eaten linens for the facility's disposal service. Sunday morning arrived with pale light filtering through the thin motel curtains. Mark sat on the edge of his bed, surrounded by the physical remnants of someone else's life, and began the slow work of sorting through it all. The first several boxes yielded exactly what he'd feared, worthless detritus. Old magazines from the 1992, their pages yellowed and brittle, cheap kitchen gadgets still in packaging. Clothing that smelled of mildew and time. A collection of VHS tapes with handwritten labels. He set aside anything that might fetch a few dollars at a yard sale, but his hope dimmed with each disappointing box. Around midday, he opened a box that sat apart from the others, slightly smaller and sealed with packing tape that had turned brown with age. The faded marker on top read, Mexico Trip 1987 in looping cursive handwriting. Mark's fingers worked carefully at the tape, mindful not to damage whatever lay inside. The cardboard flaps opened with a soft crack of dried adhesive. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be yellowed linen cloth and brittle newspaper, were several objects of varying sizes. Mark lifted the first bundle, his hands instinctively gentle from years of handling museum pieces. The newspaper was from 1987, confirming the box's label. He unwrapped it slowly. A stone fragment, roughly the size of his palm, emerged from the wrapping. The surface was carved with symbols, glyphs that Mark recognized immediately from his archaeological training. His breath caught in his throat. The carving style was unmistakably Mayan. The stone itself showed the patina of genuine age, not the artificial weathering of modern reproductions. The glyphs were crisp, but worn in ways that suggested centuries rather than decades. Mark set it down with trembling hands and reached for another wrapped bundle. This one revealed a second fragment, larger, with more elaborate carvings. Then another, and another. By the time he'd unwrapped everything in the box, 7 stone fragments lay arranged on the motel's worn carpet, each one covered in pre-Columbian writing. His heart hammered against his ribs. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't just appear in abandoned storage units. They belonged in museums, in university collections, in places with security and climate control, and professionals who knew what they were doing. But here they were, sitting on cheap carpet next to his unmade bed. Mark grabbed his phone and began photographing each piece from multiple angles, his hands shaking so badly that several photos came out blurred. He had to stop, breathe, force himself to be methodical. This required documentation, careful examination, professional verification. At the bottom of the box, beneath where the wrapped artifacts had rested, Mark found a leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked and faded, but intact. He opened it carefully. The handwriting inside matched the marker on the box, the same looping cursive, now in blue ink that had faded to a pale ghost of itself. The first page read, "Collection Documentation Harold Pemberton, 1962 to 1991. Mark's hands steadied as he began to read. Harold Pemberton had been an amateur archaeologist and collector, documenting each acquisition with dates, locations, and circumstances. The entries were meticulous, almost obsessive in their detail. March 1978, acquired from estate sale of Dr. Raymond Finch, professor of Mesoamerican Studies, deceased. 3 stone tablet fragments, provenance documented to 1964 expedition in Guatemala. Legal export permits on file. July 1982, purchased from authorized dealer in Mexico City. 2 additional fragments, believed to be part of same ceremonial complex as 1978 acquisition. All documentation verified through Mexican Cultural Ministry. Page after page detailed similar acquisitions, all seemingly legal, all carefully documented. Harold Pemberton hadn't been a looter or a smuggler. He'd been a passionate collector who'd done things properly, or at least believed he had. The final entries were different in tone. January 1991. Diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Prognosis poor. Must organize collection, ensure proper disposition. Family has no interest in these pieces. They see only old rocks, not the stories they tell. February 1991. Contacted several museums. Most show polite interest, but no commitment. Budget constraints, they say. Acquisition committees move slowly. I don't have time for slow. March 1991. Moved collection to storage. Can't bear to have them in-house during treatment. Too many memories of healthier times, of travels and discoveries. Will figure out proper home once I'm feeling stronger. The entries stopped there. Mark calculated quickly. Harold Pemberton had sealed these artifacts away over 30 years ago. The storage unit payments must have continued automatically for years, then eventually lapsed. The facility would have sent notices to an address where no one lived anymore. Eventually, they'd auctioned the contents. Mark sat back against the bed, mind racing. These artifacts were authentic, or at least Harold Pemberton had believed they were, and his documentation suggested legitimate provenance. But without professional verification, Mark's opinion meant nothing. He needed experts. He thought of his former colleagues at the museum, then dismissed the idea. Mrs. Landry would either ignore him or try to claim the discovery for the institution. He needed someone he could trust, someone with the expertise to verify what he'd found and the integrity to give him honest guidance. Dr. Vivian Kessler. The name came to him like a gift. Vivian had been a guest lecturer at the museum 3 years ago, brought in for a special exhibition on Mesoamerican cultures. Mark had assisted with the artifact loans and installation. They'd spent hours discussing pottery styles, architectural symbolism, and the challenges of ethical archaeology in a post-colonial world. She taught at the State University, specializing in Mayan civilization. Mark found her faculty page online and sent an email before he could overthink it. He kept it brief, mentioned their previous work together, said he'd come across some stone fragments with Mayan-style glyphs, asked if she might be willing to look at photographs and offer her professional opinion. He hit send and immediately felt foolish. Why would a respected archaeologist take time to look at photos from someone who'd been fired from a small-town museum? She probably received dozens of similar requests from amateur treasure hunters, convinced they'd found something significant. But 20 minutes later, his phone chimed with a response. Mark, good to hear from you. Send the photos. If they're what you think they are, we should talk immediately. V. Mark's hands shook again as he attached the clearest photographs and sent them off. He tried to distract himself by continuing to sort through other boxes, but his attention kept drifting back to his phone. 2 hours passed. Then his phone rang, Vivian's name on the screen. Mark. Her voice was tense with controlled excitement. He explained about the storage unit, about Harold Pemberton's journal, about the documentation of legal acquisitions. Vivian listened without interrupting. I need to see them in person, she said when he finished. Those photographs show stylistic markers consistent with classic Maya period, possibly royal or ceremonial context. If they're authentic, Mark, they're museum quality, potentially quite valuable. How valuable? His voice came out as a whisper. I can't say without proper examination and authentication, but if provenance is solid and they're genuine, we're talking about pieces that could reshape understanding of specific historical periods. The academic value alone is immense. They arranged to meet the following afternoon at a coffee shop halfway between the city and the university. Vivian insisted on discretion, no mention of the discovery to anyone until she'd examined everything properly. After the call ended, Mark sat in the growing darkness of his motel room, surrounded by boxes and fragments of ancient stone. His mind couldn't quite process what was happening. He picked up one of the stone fragments, feeling its weight, the coolness of the stone against his palm. Someone had carved these symbols centuries ago, had poured meaning and purpose into every line. Those carvings had survived wars, conquest, centuries of weather and neglect. They'd passed through Harold Pemberton's careful hands, had sat forgotten in darkness for decades. And now they'd found their way to Mark Ellison, a failed museum cataloguer living in a motel room. The universe had a strange sense of timing. Monday morning found Mark awake before dawn, exhausted but unable to sleep. He'd spent the night researching Mayan glyphs, cross-referencing Harold Pemberton's journal entries with online archaeological databases, trying to piece together what he might actually possess. The meeting with Vivian wasn't until 2 in the afternoon. The hours stretched ahead of him like an eternity. He showered in the motel's cramped bathroom. Dressed in the same khakis and button-down shirt he'd worn to the auction, his only presentable outfit. In the mirror, he barely recognized himself. When had his face become so drawn, so lined with worry? 49 felt ancient this morning. At noon, he carefully wrapped the smallest stone fragment, the one with the clearest glyphs, in a clean T-shirt and placed it in his worn messenger bag along with Harold Pemberton's journal. His hands moved with the practiced care of his museum years, mindful of every jostle and impact. The coffee shop Vivian had chosen was a local chain, busy enough to provide cover, but quiet enough for conversation. Mark arrived 20 minutes early and claimed a corner table, ordering black coffee he didn't drink, just held between his palms for something to do with his nervous energy. Vivian arrived exactly on time. She'd aged well in the 3 years since he'd seen her, maybe 55 now, with silver threading through her dark hair, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore practical field clothes, khaki pants, and a lightweight jacket, like someone ready to dig at a moment's notice. "Mark!" She shook his hand firmly, then sat across from him. "Show me. No pleasantries, no small talk." Mark appreciated that. He pulled the wrapped fragment from his bag, setting it on the table between them. Vivian produced a jeweler's loupe from her pocket and a small portable UV light tools of her trade, always at hand. She unwrapped the fragment with practiced efficiency, and Mark saw her posture change the moment she laid eyes on it. Her examination took 10 minutes. She studied the glyphs with the loupe, ran her fingers along the carved edges, tested the stone's weight and density. She shone the UV light across the surface, looking for signs of artificial aging or modern tool marks. Finally, she set down her tools and looked at Mark with an expression he couldn't quite read. "This is genuine," she said quietly. "Classic Maya period, roughly 7th or 8th century, based on the glyph style. The stone is limestone, consistent with quarries in the Petén region. The carving technique matches known examples from that era. The weathering patterns are authentic. You can't fake centuries of mineral deposits and erosion." Mark's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as he set it down. His hands had started shaking again. "You said there are more pieces?" Vivian asked. 6 more fragments, similar size, similar carving styles, all documented in the collector's journal with acquisition dates and provenance information. And the collector, this Harold Pemberton, he's deceased. Over 30 years ago, the storage unit was abandoned, eventually auctioned for non-payment. Vivian sat back, processing. Legal acquisition in the 1,960 seconds through 80 seconds before NAGPRA and many current repatriation laws. If his documentation is solid, ownership would default to whoever purchased the storage unit contents. She paused. "Which would be you." The word hung between them. Ownership. Mark owned pieces of history that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. "What do I do?" he asked. "First, we need complete authentication, radiocarbon dating if possible, though that requires sampling, and you'd want to be very careful about that. I'd want to bring in colleagues, epigraphy specialists who can translate the glyphs, materials scientists who can verify the stone source, conservation experts who can assess condition and preservation needs. I can't afford any of that." The words came out flat, honest. "I don't have money for experts or testing. I used my last $100 to buy that storage unit." Vivian studied him for a long moment. "You were at the museum, weren't you, when they did the layoffs?" Mark nodded. "I'm sorry. That institution lost a good person." She drummed her fingers on the table, thinking, there might be another way. The university has a cultural heritage department with full authentication facilities. If you were willing to partner with them, they could handle all the testing and verification. "Partner how?" "You'd retain ownership, but grant them access for study and authentication. In exchange, they cover all costs. If the pieces prove as significant as I think they are, there would likely be a finder's fee, a percentage of appraised value. Plus, they might offer you a consulting position during the authentication process." Mark's mind raced through the implications. A finder's fee, a consulting position, the possibility of legitimacy, of purpose, of not having to spend another month in this motel room wondering where his next meal would come from. "Who would I need to talk to?" he asked. "Dr. Gregory Ashford. He's the department head, handles all major acquisitions and partnerships. I can arrange a meeting, vouch for both you and the artifacts." "But Mark," she leaned forward, her expression serious, "once you enter into this kind of agreement, you're committing to a process. Authentication can take months. There will be legal reviews, ethical considerations, possibly disputes over ownership or repatriation. This won't be quick or simple. I don't need quick, Mark said. I need real. Vivian smiled, the first warmth he'd seen from her. Then let me make some calls. They spent another hour at the coffee shop while Vivian worked her phone, speaking in the shorthand of academic colleagues, arranging meetings and favors. Mark listened, still half convinced this was all some elaborate dream he'd wake from back in his motel room. But it wasn't a dream. By the time they left the coffee shop, Mark had an appointment scheduled for Thursday morning with Dr. Ashford and 2 other specialists from the university's Cultural Heritage Department. Bring everything, Vivian instructed as they stood beside their cars. The fragments, the journal, any documentation you have. And Mark, don't mention this to anyone else yet. Not until we know exactly what we're dealing with. Mark drove back to the motel in a daze, his mind spinning through possibilities and fears in equal measure. Thursday was 3 days away. 3 days to prepare, to organize his documentation, to convince himself he wasn't about to make a complete fool of himself in front of academics who spent their lives studying these things. Back in his room, he spread Harold Pemberton's journal open on the bed and began reading more carefully, making notes, cross-referencing entries. The man had been meticulous, almost to the point of obsession. Every acquisition documented with dates, sources, prices paid, authentication methods used. May 1973 met with Dr. Finch at his home. He showed me his private collection, pieces acquired during his tenure in Guatemala. We discussed the ethical complexities of cultural heritage, the balance between preservation and repatriation. He believes these pieces teach more by being accessible than by being returned to contexts where they might be lost again to looting or neglect. I'm not certain I agree, but I understand his reasoning. Mark found himself drawn to Harold Pemberton's voice in these pages. The man had wrestled with questions that still resonated today. Who had the right to possess fragments of the past? How did you balance preservation with cultural ownership? When did appreciation become appropriation? These weren't simple questions. They didn't have easy answers. His phone buzzed. A text from Dennis. How'd the storage unit work out? Find anything good? Mark stared at the message. He wanted to tell Dennis everything, to share this incredible turn of events with the man who'd made it possible by lending him that $100. But Vivian's warning echoed in his mind. Discretion until they knew what they were dealing with. He typed back, still sorting through everything. Might have found some interesting pieces. I'll let you know. And Dennis, thank you. For the loan, for believing in me. The reply came quickly. Any time, friend. That's what we do. Mark set down his phone and returned to the journal, to the stone fragments arranged carefully on his dresser, to the strange new reality taking shape around him. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. Tuesday morning, Mark returned to the storage unit. He still had until Wednesday to clear it completely, and something nagged at him, a feeling that he hadn't looked carefully enough, that he'd missed something in his initial rush to empty the space. The unit stood open in the morning heat, mostly bare now, except for the furniture he'd left behind and a few boxes he'd deemed worthless. But as Mark stepped inside, his trained eye caught something he'd overlooked before. The boxes hadn't been stacked randomly. There was a pattern to their arrangement, a logic. The worthless boxes, old magazines, clothes, household items, had been placed on top, almost deliberately obscuring what lay beneath. Harold Pemberton had been protecting something. Mark began moving boxes more systematically, creating a clear path to the back wall. There, hidden behind a draped sheet and what appeared to be an old bookshelf, sat a wooden crate. Not cardboard, actual wood, the kind used for shipping valuable items. Stenciled on the side in faded paint, fragile ceremonial items. His pulse quickened as he maneuvered the crate away from the wall. It was heavier than expected, maybe 40 pounds. The lid had been nailed shut, but time had loosened the nails. Mark worked carefully, using the edge of his car key to pry them up one by one. Inside, nested in what looked like old burlap and shredded newspaper, lay 3 objects wrapped individually in cloth. Mark lifted the first package out, his hands steady now with practiced purpose. He knew he was holding something significant even before he unwrapped it. The jade burial mask emerged from its wrapping like a face rising from sleep. Roughly the size of a human face, carved from pale green jade, it showed the stylized features of Maya nobility, almond-shaped eyes, broad nose, slightly open mouth. One corner was cracked, a piece missing from the left cheek, but the majority remained intact. Mark's breath caught. Burial masks like this were reserved for the elite, for rulers and high priests. They represented the deceased's journey to the afterlife, their transformation into something divine. Museums fought over pieces like this, collectors paid fortunes, and it had been sitting in a storage unit for 3 decades, forgotten. He carefully wrapped it again and set it aside, then reached for the second bundle. This one revealed a ceremonial blade made from obsidian, the volcanic glass polished to a mirror sheen despite its age. The handle was carved bone, decorated with glyphs and geometric patterns. The blade itself was about 8 inches long, sharp enough that Mark could see his reflection in its surface. The third object was a ceramic vessel, maybe 12 inches tall, painted with intricate scenes in red, black and cream. The images depicted what appeared to be a ceremonial gathering figures in elaborate headdresses, glyphs framing the narrative, architectural elements suggesting a palace or temple setting. Mark sat back on his heels, surrounded by artifacts that belonged in a museum. His small motel room already held 7 stone fragments. Now this, Harold Pemberton's collection, was far more extensive than he'd initially realized. He needed to get these to safety immediately. The drive back to the motel felt longer than usual, every pothole making him wince, every traffic light an eternity. He kept glancing at the crate secured in his passenger seat, imagining catastrophic accidents, imagining everything shattering before he could get it documented. But he made it safely. In his room, he photographed each new piece methodically, then sent the images to Vivian with a brief message. Found more. Same unit. We need to talk. Her response came within minutes. Don't touch anything else. I'm calling Ashford. This changes everything. Mark's phone rang 20 seconds later. Mark, this is serious now. Vivian's voice carried an urgency he hadn't heard before. That burial mask alone, if it's authentic and legally acquired, we're talking about a museum centerpiece, the kind of artifact that defines collections. I'm moving your meeting with Ashford to tomorrow morning. Can you make 9 a.m.? Yes, absolutely. Bring everything. Every fragment, every piece, all documentation. And Mark, I know this sounds paranoid, but be careful. Collections like this attract attention, not all of it good. After the call, Mark looked around his shabby motel room with new eyes. The door lock was flimsy. The windows faced the parking lot. Anyone could break in with minimal effort. He'd been so focused on his own desperation that he hadn't considered security. He repacked everything carefully into boxes, then loaded them into his car. He'd sleep in the vehicle tonight if he had to, parked where he could keep watch. But first, he needed to make a call he'd been avoiding. Jake answered on the 3rd ring. Dad? Everything okay? Mark heard the concern in his son's voice and felt a stab of guilt. When was the last time he'd called just to talk, not because something was wrong? I'm fine, son. Just wanted to hear your voice. You sure? You sound weird. Mark almost told him everything right then. The job loss, the eviction, the storage unit, the artifacts. But Vivian's warning about discretion held him back. Not yet. Not until he knew this was real. Work's been stressful, he said instead, hating the half-truth. How are things with you? They talked for 20 minutes. Jake filling him in on a project at work, some trouble with his apartment's plumbing, a woman he'd been seeing casually. Normal life things. Mark listened, absorbing the ordinariness of his son's existence, so far removed from the strange turn his own life had taken. "We should get together soon," Jake said as the conversation wound down. "Maybe I could drive up next month, take you to dinner?" "I'd like that," Mark said, meaning it. "I'd really like that." After they hung up, Mark sat in the growing darkness of his motel room, now mostly empty, with the artifacts packed away, and thought about the distance between them. Not just geographical distance, but emotional. When had he become someone who couldn't tell his own son when life was falling apart? Pride again, that poison that kept him isolated even when he needed help most. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Ellison, this is Gregory Ashford from the university. Dr. Kessler has briefed me on your discovery. Very much looking forward to our meeting tomorrow. 9A. M. Cultural Heritage Department, Whitman Hall. Please bring all materials and documentation. Best regards." Mark read the message 3 times, each reading making it feel more real. A university department head taking time to meet with him, Vivian vouching for him. A path forward where yesterday there had been only closed doors and dead ends. He thought about Harold Pemberton again, about the meticulous collector who'd spent decades assembling these pieces, who died before finding them a proper home. The man had written in his journal about wanting these artifacts to mean something, to teach something, to connect past and present in meaningful ways. Mark could honor that. Whatever happened next, authentication, valuation, partnerships, he could make sure Harold Pemberton's life's work ended up somewhere it would matter. He locked the motel room door and climbed into his car, reclining the driver's seat as far as it would go. Not comfortable, but he could doze, keep watch, make sure nothing happened to the artifacts before tomorrow's meeting. Through the windshield, stars appeared in the darkening sky. The same stars that had shone down on the Maya when they'd carved these stones, when they'd crafted these ceremonial objects. The same stars that would shine long after Mark was gone, after everyone currently alive was gone. There was something humbling about that perspective, something that made his own troubles feel smaller while simultaneously making this discovery feel larger. He closed his eyes, one hand resting on the box containing the jade mask, and tried to sleep. Tomorrow would change everything. He could feel it. Whitman Hall stood at the center of the university campus, a brick building with white columns that spoke of academic tradition and institutional weight. Mark arrived 15 minutes early, his car loaded with carefully packed boxes, his nerves strung tight as piano wire. A graduate student met him at the entrance, a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a university sweatshirt. She introduced herself as Priya Singh, doctoral candidate in Mesoamerican archaeology, working under Dr. Kessler. "Let me help you with those," she said, reaching for one of the boxes Mark was juggling. Together they carried everything to a third-floor conference room where Vivian was already waiting, along with 2 men Mark didn't recognize. The older one, perhaps 60, had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, expensive suit, silver hair, sharp eyes that assessed Mark in a single glance. The younger man, maybe 40, wore more casual academic attire and held a tablet computer. "Mark Ellison," Vivian made the introductions. "This is Dr. Gregory Ashford, department head, and Dr. Philip Cunningham, our lead conservator." Handshakes were exchanged. Ashford's grip was firm, businesslike. Cunningham's was gentler, the hands of someone who worked with delicate objects. "Dr. Kessler has shown us your photographs," Ashford said, gesturing for Mark to sit at the conference table. "Quite remarkable, if they prove authentic. Let's see what you've brought." Mark began unpacking the boxes, setting each artifact on the padded surface Priya had prepared. The stone fragments first, then the jade mask, the obsidian blade, the ceramic vessel, the jaguar figurine he'd noticed at the auction. Finally, Harold Pemberton's journal, which he placed in front of Ashford. The room fell silent as the academics examined the pieces. Cunningham produced tools similar to Vivian's loops, UV lights, calipers. He measured, photographed, made notes on his tablet. Vivian focused on the glyphs, tracing their shapes with a gloved finger, murmuring to herself. Ashford read through Pemberton's journal with methodical attention, occasionally pausing to cross-reference an entry with one of the artifacts. "This ceramic vessel," Priya said suddenly, her voice tight with excitement. She'd been examining it with a magnifying glass. "Dr. Kessler, look at this narrative sequence." Vivian moved to her side, and together they studied the painted scenes. Their conversation became rapid, technical, full of terminology. Mark only half understood references to dynastic periods, ceramic styles, iconographic conventions. "If I'm reading this correctly," Priya said, "this depicts a royal succession ceremony. See these glyphs here? And this figure with the elaborate headdress that's consistent with known depictions of 8th century rulers in the Pe-10 region. Can you date it more precisely?" Ashford asked. "The ceramic style suggests late classic period, probably 650 to 750 CE, but I'd need to do comparative analysis with dated examples from museum collections. This narrative sequence, if we can translate the full glyph text, it might reference specific historical events we can correlate with other sources." Mark watched them work, feeling like an outsider at his own discovery. These people spoke a language he understood only partially, moved in professional circles he'd only observed from the periphery during his museum years. "Mr. Ellison," Ashford said, looking up from the journal. "This documentation is exceptionally thorough. Harold Pemberton was quite meticulous about recording provenance. Based on these entries and the dates involved, it appears all acquisitions predated the 1970 UNESCO Convention and were conducted through legal channels as they existed at the time." "What does that mean?" Mark asked. "It means ownership shouldn't be legally complicated, at least not in terms of how the collection was originally acquired. There are still ethical considerations we'll need to address, but the legal framework appears sound." Cunningham set down his tools. "Preliminary assessment suggests everything here is authentic. The weathering patterns are consistent with genuine age, the materials are appropriate to the purported time periods, and the craftsmanship matches known examples. Obviously, we'll need proper testing, radiocarbon dating where possible, materials analysis, full conservation assessment. But I'm confident we're looking at genuine pre-Columbian artifacts." The words settled over Mark like a weight and a blessing simultaneously. Real. It was all real. "Let's discuss next steps," Ashford said, his tone shifting to business. "Mr. Ellison, would you be open to a partnership with the university?" "What kind of partnership?" "You would retain legal ownership of the collection. However, you would grant us exclusive rights to study, authenticate, conserve, and potentially exhibit these pieces. In exchange, the university covers all costs associated with authentication and conservation. Additionally, we would offer you a consulting position part-time, paid to assist with cataloguing and research. Your background in museum work makes you uniquely qualified." Mark's heart hammered. A paying position. A reason to get up in the morning that wasn't desperation. "And if the collection proves as valuable as we think," Ashford continued, "standard practice would be a finder's fee, typically 10 to 15% of appraised value, paid upon completion of authentication and any subsequent sale or donation to a permanent collection." 10 to 15%, Mark repeated, his mind struggling with the mathematics. "If these pieces were worth what their initial reactions suggested." "We're not talking about immediate wealth," Ashford cautioned, reading his expression. "Authentication takes months, sometimes years. Appraisal is complex with cultural heritage items, and there are ethical considerations we haven't fully explored yet. But yes, eventually, there would be significant compensation." "I don't need immediate," Mark said. I need something that matters. Vivian smiled at that. Then we understand each other. They spent the next hour discussing logistics. Mark would bring the remaining artifacts from the storage unit tomorrow. The university would provide secure storage in their climate-controlled vault. Priya would begin detailed cataloguing. Cunningham would start conservation assessments. Vivian would lead the translation work on the glyphs. Mark's consulting position would begin immediately 3 days a week, enough to provide steady income while allowing time for the authentication process. As the meeting concluded and Mark prepared to leave the artifacts in the university's care, Ashford extended his hand once more. Welcome aboard, Mr. Ellison. I think this is the beginning of something significant. Walking across campus afterward, Mark felt lighter than he had in months. The weight of the artifacts was gone, literally transferred to secure storage, but more than that, the weight of purposelessness had lifted. He had work again, real work, work that meant something. His phone rang. Dennis. Hey, Mark. Just checking in. You've been quiet. Everything all right? Mark stood on the campus quad, watching students hurry between classes, living their normal lives while his had just turned extraordinary. Dennis, remember that $100 you lent me? Yeah, of course. No rush paying it back, man. I'm going to pay you back next week. With interest. Mark, you don't have to. I want to. And Dennis, I need to tell you something. That storage unit, I think I might have found something important, something real. There was a pause. Yeah? Like what? I'll explain everything soon. I just wanted you to know. None of this happens without you believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. That's what friends do, Mark. After they hung up, Mark stood for a moment longer, breathing in the autumn air, feeling the sun on his face. For the first time in months, maybe years, he felt like himself again. 3 weeks into his consulting position, Mark had established a routine, mornings at the university, working alongside Priya in the catalogue room, afternoons researching provenance and historical context. The modest stipend from his position allowed him to move from the weekly motel to a month-to-month efficiency apartment, nothing fancy, but it had a real kitchen and windows that didn't look out on a parking lot. The authentication process was progressing steadily. Carbon dating results had started coming back, confirming dates in the late classic period for most pieces. Cunningham's conservation work revealed details invisible to the naked eye, traces of pigment on stone fragments, residue analysis on the ceremonial blade, structural assessments of the jade mask's condition. But it was Priya's work on the ceramic vessel that had captured everyone's attention. Mark, come, look at this, she called one morning from her workstation. He crossed the catalogue room to where she had the vessel positioned under specialized lighting, her tablet displaying enlarged photographs of the painted glyphs. I've been cross-referencing these date notations with known historical records, she explained, her excitement barely contained. This glyph sequence here, it corresponds to a date in the Maya long count calendar that translates to approximately 721 CE. And this figure, she pointed to a painted nobleman in an elaborate headdress. The glyphs identify him as a specific ruler whose name appears in other inscriptions from the region. Which means what exactly? Mark asked. It means we can date this vessel precisely. More than that, we can connect it to known historical events, to a specific royal court, maybe even to a specific ceremony. This isn't just an artifact, Mark. It's a primary historical document. It's like finding a photograph of something that happened 1,300 years ago. Mark studied the painted scenes with new appreciation. Someone had sat with this vessel, had painted these images while the events were fresh in memory, had captured a moment in time that would outlive empires. Your background, Priya said, glancing at him. Dr. Kessler mentioned you studied archaeology in college? A long time ago. I ended up in cataloguing instead of fieldwork. Why? The question was simple, but the answer wasn't. Mark found himself telling her about the early marriage, about responsibilities that took precedence over dreams, about choices that seemed necessary at the time but left him wondering what might have been. "My parents immigrated from India when I was 6, Priya said, settling into the conversation. "They worked themselves to exhaustion so I could go to college. My father wanted me to be a doctor or engineer, something practical, something that guaranteed success. When I told them I wanted to study ancient civilizations, they thought I was throwing away their sacrifice." "How did they react when you chose archaeology?" "They didn't understand it at first, but eventually my father said something that stuck with me. I came to this country so you could have choices. If you choose to study the past, at least choose to do it with excellence. So that's what I'm doing." Mark smiled. "Sounds like you made the right choice." "Sometimes losing one path opens another," Priya said. "Maybe your cataloguing years weren't wasted. Maybe they taught you exactly what you needed to know for this moment." The thought stayed with Mark as he returned to his own work, documenting measurements and conditions for each artifact. Perhaps nothing was truly wasted. Perhaps all those quiet years at the museum had been preparation, teaching him patience and attention to detail, skills that mattered now more than ever. That afternoon, the local newspaper published a feature story. "University researchers authenticate Mayan treasure found in storage unit." The article was careful, avoiding sensationalism, but it detailed the discovery and Mark's role in it. His name appeared multiple times. His photograph, taken in the catalogue room, holding one of the stone fragments, ran with the story. By evening, his phone was ringing constantly. Old colleagues from the museum, curious about the details, a few reporters asking for interviews. One call from a smooth-voiced man who identified himself as a private collector interested in purchasing the collection. "I'm afraid the collection isn't for sale," Mark said politely. "Everything's for sale at the right price, Mr. Ellison. I'd be happy to make you an offer that would set you up comfortably for life." Mark ended the call without responding further, but it left him unsettled. He reported it to Ashford the next morning. "We expected this," Ashford said. "Discoveries like yours attract attention from all quarters, some of it legitimate scholarly interest, some of it less so. If anyone else contacts you, direct them to our legal department." Security around the artifacts increased. The catalogue room required keycard access. Priya and Mark were instructed to be cautious about discussing details of their work outside the department. The heightened security felt both necessary and paranoid. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were protecting something that perhaps shouldn't have been his to protect in the first place. Late one afternoon, unable to concentrate on documentation, Mark did something he'd been avoiding. He researched Harold Pemberton more thoroughly. The obituary he'd found earlier had been brief, but now he dug deeper. He found a short profile from a 1985 archaeology magazine, Amateur Collector Preserves Pre-Columbian Heritage. The article painted Pemberton as a passionate enthusiast, someone who'd spent his modest inheritance traveling to archaeological sites, attending academic conferences, building relationships with dealers and scholars. He found a photograph of Pemberton from the article, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and kind eyes, standing beside a display case of pottery. He looked earnest, dedicated, slightly awkward in the way of people more comfortable with objects than with people. Mark understood that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror often enough. He found Pemberton's death certificate online, pancreatic cancer, as the journal entries had indicated. Died at age 62, never married, no children. The only listed relative was a cousin in another state who'd declined to handle the estate. On impulse, Mark looked up the cemetery where Pemberton was buried. It was on the other side of town, a small municipal cemetery with simple headstones and well-maintained grounds. The following Saturday, Mark drove there with a bouquet of flowers from the grocery store, nothing fancy, just chrysanthemums, because they seemed appropriate for autumn and for remembering the dead. Pemberton's grave was in a far corner. a modest flat marker with just his name and dates. No epitaph, no decoration. The grass around it was trimmed, but there were no signs that anyone visited regularly. Mark laid the flowers on the grave and stood there for a long moment, feeling foolish and yet somehow compelled to speak. "Mr. Pemberton, I'm Mark Ellison. I'm the one who bought your storage unit. I found your collection, your life's work. I want you to know I'm taking care of it. I'm making sure it matters, that it means something, the way you wanted it to." The words felt inadequate, but they were all he had. "I understand what it's like to care about things that other people don't value," Mark continued. "To spend your life on something that matters to you even when it doesn't make sense to anyone else. I'm going to honor that, I promise." A breeze rustled the trees overhead. Mark stood a while longer, then returned to his car. He'd made a promise to a dead man. Now he had to figure out how to keep it. The final boxes from Storage Unit 247 sat unopened in the corner of the catalogue room for nearly a month. Mark and Priya had been focused on the major pieces, the stone fragments, the jade mask, the ceremonial blade, the painted vessel. These smaller boxes had been catalogued as miscellaneous materials, low priority, and set aside. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, with most of the authentication work entering a waiting phase, labs processing samples, specialists writing reports, Mark decided to tackle them. The first two boxes contained exactly what he expected: tourist-grade reproductions, pamphlets from archaeological sites, travel souvenirs that Harold Pemberton had apparently collected during his trips. Nothing of value, just the ephemera of a life spent pursuing a passion. The third box was different. It was smaller than the others, heavier, made of sturdy cardboard that had held up better over the decades, no label on the outside. When Mark opened it, he found a cylindrical clay container about 12 inches long and 4 inches in diameter, sealed with what appeared to be wax. "Priya, come look at this," he called. She crossed the room, wiping dust from her hands. "What is it?" "I'm not sure. Some kind of sealed container. Should we open it or let Cunningham handle it?" "Let's X-ray it first. If there's something fragile inside, we don't want to damage it." They took the cylinder to the imaging lab. The technician, a young man named Garrett who seemed perpetually caffeinated, positioned it under the X-ray machine and brought up the image on his screen. "Interesting," he murmured. "Looks like rolled paper or bark inside. See these layers? And what might be another object, something denser, maybe metal?" Mark's pulse quickened. "Can we open it safely? Cunningham's lab has the proper tools and environment. Want me to call him?" 20 minutes later, they were in the conservation lab, watching as Cunningham carefully broke the wax seal. The cylinder was clay, undecorated, made for function rather than beauty. The kind of container used to protect important documents. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that crumbled at the slightest touch, was a roll of bark paper, a fragment of Maya Codex. Priya gasped audibly. Only 4 complete Maya codices had survived the Spanish conquest. Even fragments were extraordinarily rare. But there was more. Tucked inside the rolled bark paper was a folded sheet of modern paper, protected by a plastic sleeve. Cunningham removed it carefully and spread it on his work surface. It was a letter, typed on an old typewriter, dated April 1991, just weeks before Harold Pemberton's death, according to the dates in his journal. Mark began reading aloud, his voice steady at first, then gradually faltering. "To whoever finds this, I am writing this in what my doctors tell me are my final weeks. The cancer has spread beyond treatment, and I find myself facing mortality with a collection I can no longer maintain and a conscience I can no longer ignore. For 30 years, I have collected pre-Columbian artifacts. I told myself I was preserving history, protecting these pieces from looters and destruction. I followed the law as it existed. I obtained proper documentation, worked with authorized dealers, never knowingly participated in illegal trade. But the law and morality are not always the same thing. 5 years ago, I began researching the true origins of my collection more thoroughly. What I discovered has haunted me ever since. Many of the pieces I acquired, purchased legally through dealers and estates, were originally removed from their source countries under circumstances that were technically legal at the time, but ethically questionable at best. The fragments of stone tablets came from a ceremonial complex in Guatemala. The site was excavated in the 1962 with government permission, but the local Maya communities who still considered it sacred were never consulted. The artifacts were sold to foreign collectors, scattered across the world, separated from their cultural context. The jade burial mask belonged to a tomb that was officially excavated, but whose contents were divided among the excavation sponsors rather than remaining in Guatemala where they originated. The ceremonial blade, the painted vessel, even the smaller pieces, all of them have similar stories. Legal removal, but removal nonetheless, taken from the peoples and places they belong to. I wanted to return them. I spent the last 2 years of my health contacting cultural ministries in Mexico and Guatemala. I included documentation with this letter, names, addresses, specific site information for each piece in my collection. But I am a coward. I feared the legal complications, the potential accusations of trafficking, even though I'd done nothing illegal. I feared my reputation being destroyed, my life's work being labeled as theft rather than preservation. So I have done what cowards do. I have hidden the problem, hoping someone braver will solve it. If you are reading this, you have found my collection. I do not know who you are or what circumstances led you here, but I am asking you to do what I could not. Please return these pieces to their rightful homes, not to museums in other countries, but to the nations and communities they came from. The documentation enclosed provides the information needed to make contact with the proper authorities. These artifacts are worth considerable money. Selling them would be legal and profitable, but some things are worth more than money. These pieces are part of living cultures, part of histories that continue today. They deserve to go home. I built this collection trying to preserve the past. I realize now that I was taking pieces of other people's heritage and calling it preservation. True preservation means context. It means connection. It means belonging to the people whose ancestors created them. I am sorry I lacked the courage to do this myself. I hope whoever finds this letter has the strength I did not. Harold Pemberton. The lab fell silent. Mark's hands trembled as he set down the letter. Behind it was indeed more documentation, lists of artifacts with their true origins, contact information for cultural heritage departments, even photocopies of the original acquisition records showing exactly where each piece had come from. "Oh God," Priya whispered. Cunningham removed his gloves slowly, his expression unreadable. Mark felt the foundation of everything shifting beneath him. The collection wasn't just authentic pre-Columbian artifacts with clean provenance. It was cultural heritage, removed from its rightful context, held by a collector who died knowing he'd participated in something wrong, even if it was legal. "We need to call Ashford," Cunningham said quietly. "This changes everything." The meeting was convened within 2 hours. Ashford, Vivian, Cunningham, Priya, and Mark gathered in the conference room where this had all begun. The letter sat in the center of the table like an accusation. "The question is straightforward," Ashford said after reading the letter twice. "It's not about his wishes," Vivian said. "It's about what's right." "We have legal ownership," Ashford countered. "Everything was acquired legally. The university has invested resources in authentication. Donors are interested in funding an exhibition. We could display this collection, use it educationally, while the communities it was taken from have nothing," Priya interrupted, her voice tight. "While ceremonies are performed without the original ritual objects because they're in our vault." Ashford looked at Mark. "You're the legal owner, Mr. Ellison. Ultimately, this is your decision." Mark stared at the letter, at Harold Pemberton's typed words, at the confession of a dying man who'd lacked courage. He thought about his promise at the grave, about doing what mattered rather than what was profitable. He thought about Jake, about what kind of example he wanted to set. "I need time to think," Mark said. "This isn't a decision to make in one afternoon." But even as he said it, he knew what the right answer was. He just had to find the courage to choose it. Mark spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with his decision. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Ashford had mentioned preliminary appraisals. Conservative estimates put the collection's value at somewhere between $2 and $4 million. Even at 10%, Mark's finder's fee would be life-changing money. Enough to buy a house, establish security, never worry about bills again. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Harold Pemberton's grave. He heard his own voice making a promise. On the 4th morning, Mark called Vivian and asked to meet for coffee. She arrived looking tired, as though she'd been sleeping as poorly as he had. They sat in the same corner booth where they'd first examined the stone fragment a lifetime ago. "I want to advocate for repatriation," Mark said without preamble. "I want to return the collection to Guatemala and Mexico." Vivian studied him for a long moment. "You understand what that means? The finder's fee gets restructured or disappears entirely. Your consulting position might not survive the political fallout. Some board members will fight this hard, I know. But Pemberton was right. These pieces belong to someone. They're not mine to keep just because I found them. The university has legal ownership through your partnership agreement. Then I'll argue to break the partnership if I have to. Vivian, you're an ethical archaeologist. You've spent your career fighting against colonial exploitation of cultural heritage. Tell me I'm wrong." She smiled sadly. "You're not wrong, but being right doesn't make it easy. Help me make the case, please." They spent the next week preparing. Vivian connected Mark with experts in cultural heritage law, with advocates from indigenous communities, with museum professionals who'd navigated repatriation processes before. Priya joined their effort immediately, providing research on the communities still living near the original sites, documenting how these artifacts connected to living cultural practices. Mark drafted a formal proposal. He researched every piece in Pemberton's collection, tracing each one back to its origin. He contacted the cultural heritage departments in Guatemala and Mexico, explaining the situation, gauging their interest in reclaiming the artifacts. The responses were enthusiastic, grateful. A representative from Guatemala's Ministry of Culture sent a long email describing how these pieces, particularly the ceremonial items, were part of ongoing traditional practices. Communities still performed ceremonies that referenced these objects, told stories about them, mourned their absence. Mark incorporated everything into his presentation. He practiced in front of Priya, who offered suggestions on pacing and emphasis. He rehearsed responses to potential objections. Jake called midway through the preparation, having seen another news article about the collection. "Dad, this sounds amazing. When do I get to see these artifacts?" Mark took a breath. It was time to tell his son everything. "Jake, I need to be honest with you about something. I lost my job 6 months ago. I got evicted. I've been living in a motel, then a cheap apartment. That storage unit auction, it was my last $100. I was desperate. Silence on the other end. Then, why didn't you tell me? Pride. Shame. Not wanting to burden you. I'm your son, Dad. I'm not a burden to help, and you're not a burden to need help." Mark's eyes stung with unexpected tears. "But I was so focused on not failing, on maintaining some dignity, that I couldn't see how much I'd already lost by pushing everyone away." "What are you going to do with the collection?" Jake asked after a moment. "I'm going to try to send it home, back to Guatemala and Mexico, to the people it actually belongs to, even though you could sell it for a fortune. Especially because of that, some things matter more than money. Then I'm proud of you, Dad, and I'm coming up this weekend. I want to be there, when you present this." The support steadied Mark in ways he hadn't expected. He called Dennis too, explaining everything, thanking him again for the loan that had started all of this. Dennis's response was characteristically straightforward. "Do what's right, Mark. That's all that matters." The board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Mark had requested permission to present before they voted on the collection's future. Ashford had agreed, though his tone suggested he wasn't optimistic about the outcome. The weekend before the meeting, Jake drove up from San Diego. They had dinner at the Italian restaurant Mark used to frequent. When life was simpler, his treat this time, a small gesture of rebuilding. "Tell me about these artifacts," Jake said over pasta. "What makes them so special?" Mark described the painted vessel with its historical narrative, the jade mask that had adorned nobility, the stone fragments with their messages from 13 centuries past. As he talked, he realized how deeply he'd come to care about these objects, not as financial assets, but as connections to human stories. "You know," Jake said thoughtfully, "I never really understood why you studied history. It seemed so impractical when I was younger. But listening to you now, you're not talking about old things, you're talking about people, about their lives and cultures and the things they valued enough to preserve." "That's exactly it," Mark said. "These aren't treasures, they're memories, they're heritage. How can I keep someone else's memories just because I was lucky enough to find them?" Monday evening, Mark stood in his small apartment, reviewing his presentation notes one final time. His hands were steady now. The nervousness had transformed into something else: resolve, purpose, the certainty that comes from making a decision you can live with. His phone buzzed with a text from Priya. "Ready for tomorrow?" "As ready as I'll ever be," he typed back. "You're doing the right thing. Whatever happens, remember that." Mark looked around his modest apartment, still mostly empty, still temporary, but no longer a prison of desperation. He'd come so far from that morning at the storage auction, standing with borrowed money and dying hope. The artifacts had given him more than the possibility of wealth. They'd given him back his purpose, reconnected him with his son, reminded him that sometimes the most valuable discoveries aren't the ones you can sell. He thought about Harold Pemberton one more time, about the dying man's letter, about the courage it took to admit you'd been wrong, even when no one would ever know. "I'll speak for both of us tomorrow," Mark said to the empty room. "I'll do what you asked." Tuesday morning dawned clear and cold. Mark dressed carefully in a suit he'd borrowed from Jake. They were close enough in size that it fit reasonably well. He gathered his presentation materials, the documentation from Pemberton's letter, the responses from cultural heritage officials in Guatemala and Mexico. Jake met him outside Whitman Hall. "You look nervous," his son observed. "I am nervous, but I'm also sure." They walked into the building together, and for the first time in longer than Mark could remember, he didn't feel alone. The conference room was fuller than he'd expected. The full board, 12 people, sat around an expanded table. Ashford at the head, Vivian and Cunningham to one side, several faces Mark didn't recognize. University administrators, probably, legal counsel, maybe donors whose support hinged on this decision. Mark took his seat at the front, Jake settling into a chair along the wall. Priya gave him an encouraging nod from her position near Vivian. Ashford called the meeting to order. "Mr. Ellison has requested time to address the board before we vote on the collection's disposition. The floor is yours, Mark." Mark stood, his presentation materials in hand, his heart steady. It was time to keep his promise. Mark stood before the board, acutely aware of 12 pairs of eyes watching him. He'd faced audiences before during his museum years, giving tours, presenting at small conferences, but never with so much at stake. "Thank you for allowing me to speak," he began, his voice steadier than he'd expected. "I want to tell you about a man named Harold Pemberton." He explained the collector's history, his passion for archaeology, his meticulous documentation. He described finding the sealed cylinder and the letter inside the dying confession of a man who'd realized too late that legal ownership and moral right weren't the same thing. Mr. Pemberton spent his final months trying to find the courage to do what he knew was right, Mark continued. He failed, not because he was a bad person, but because making the right choice sometimes means sacrificing everything you've built. I understand that fear. I've lived it. He pulled out one of the stone fragments from a protective case and held it up for the board to see. This fragment depicts a historical event from 721 CE. We know this because Dr. Singh has translated the glyphs. But it's not just history to the Maya communities living near where this was found. It's their history. It's part of ceremonies they still perform, stories they still tell, cultural practices that continue today, except they're doing it without the objects that give those practices meaning. One of the board members, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, leaned forward. Mr. Ellison, we appreciate the sentiment, but the university has invested considerable resources in authenticating this collection. We have donors interested in funding an exhibition. The educational value is greater if these pieces go home, Mark interrupted, then softened his tone. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but consider what we could teach by returning them. We could document the entire process, create a traveling exhibition about repatriation itself, show students what ethical archaeology looks like in practice. Vivian spoke up. The academic community is moving toward repatriation as the standard, not the exception. Museums worldwide are beginning to return cultural heritage to origin countries. If this university takes a stand now, we position ourselves as leaders in that movement. At what cost? Another board member asked. We're already facing budget cuts. Losing potential revenue from this collection could be offset by the positive attention, Priya interjected. Other institutions are watching how we handle this. Taking the ethical path enhances our reputation, attracts grants focused on cultural heritage, justice, appeals to younger donors who care about these issues. Mark could see the board dividing, some faces sympathetic, others skeptical. He needed to reach them on a level beyond policy and budgets. When I bought that storage unit, I had nothing, he said quietly. I'd lost my job, my home, my sense of who I was. I was betting my last $100 on finding something, anything, that might help me survive another month. And I found this collection. I found value beyond anything I'd imagined. He set the stone fragment down carefully on the table. But the real value wasn't the artifacts themselves. It was what they taught me about what matters, about connecting to something larger than my own survival, about honoring the past by making it meaningful in the present. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each board member. I could sell this collection and live comfortably for the rest of my life. Instead, I'm standing here asking you to help me send it home. Not because I'm noble or selfless, I'm not. But because my son is sitting in this room watching what choice I make. Because a man named Harold Pemberton died wishing he'd been braver. Because sometimes the right thing costs something, and it's worth paying anyway. Mark pulled out the documentation Pemberton had sealed with the codex fragment detailed provenance for each piece, contact information for cultural officials, even translations of the correspondence Pemberton had begun before losing his courage. I have responses from the Guatemalan Ministry of Culture and Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology, he continued. They're prepared to work with us on a phased repatriation. The university maintains research access. We collaborate on publications. We document the process for educational purposes. This isn't about losing the collection, it's about transforming our relationship to it. And your finder's fee? Ashford asked. You understand that would be substantially reduced or eliminated entirely under a repatriation scenario. I understand. I'm proposing that any reduced fee be directed toward establishing a cultural heritage scholarship fund. Turn whatever profit there might have been into something that supports the next generation of archaeologists committed to ethical practice. The room fell silent. Mark could see calculations happening behind various faces, political considerations, financial implications, reputational risks. "Mr. Ellison," the stern board member said, her expression softening slightly. "This is quite possibly the most principled presentation I've heard in 20 years on this board." "But principle doesn't pay the bills," another member interjected. "We have a responsibility to this institution's financial health." "We also have a responsibility to intellectual integrity," Vivian countered, "to modeling the values we claim to teach. You can't run an ethics program while hoarding cultural heritage that doesn't belong to you." The debate continued, board members arguing points of law and policy, of finances and reputation. Mark stood quietly, having said everything he could say. The decision was out of his hands now. Finally, Ashford raised his hand for silence. "I think we need to vote. But before we do, I want to read something." He pulled out Harold Pemberton's letter and read aloud the final paragraph, the dying man's plea for someone braver to do what he could not. "This institution exists to pursue truth," Ashford said when he finished. "Sometimes truth is uncomfortable. Sometimes it costs us something, but we can't claim to value education and ethics while ignoring both when it's inconvenient." He looked directly at Mark. "Mr. Ellison, please step outside with your son while the board deliberates. We'll call you back shortly." Mark and Jake waited in the hallway, neither speaking much. Through the door, they could hear raised voices, though the words were indistinct. "Whatever happens," Jake said, "I'm proud of you. Even if I just cost myself a fortune, especially because of that." 25 minutes passed, then 30. Mark paced the corridor, his mind running through every possible outcome, trying to prepare himself for disappointment. The door opened. Priya stepped out, her expression unreadable. "They want you back inside," she said. Mark exchanged a glance with Jake, then walked back into the conference room. The board members' faces gave nothing away. Ashford stood at the head of the table, a single sheet of paper in his hands. "Mr. Ellison," he began, and Mark's heart hammered against his ribs. "This board has voted on the question of repatriation," Ashford continued, his voice measured and formal. "After considerable debate and consultation with our legal counsel, this board has voted 7-5 in favor of pursuing a phased repatriation agreement with the Cultural Heritage Ministries of Guatemala and Mexico." Mark's knees nearly buckled. He gripped the back of the chair in front of him for support. "The terms are as follows," Ashford said, reading from the paper. "The university will partner with the respective cultural ministries to authenticate, conserve, and eventually return all artifacts in the Pemberton collection to their countries of origin. We will maintain collaborative research agreements, allowing our faculty and students continued scholarly access to the materials." He looked up from the paper directly at Mark. "Your finder's fee has been restructured. Rather than a percentage of appraised value, you'll receive a modest, fixed compensation of $50,000, paid over 2 years. Additionally, we're offering you a full-time position as Cultural Heritage Liaison, a newly created role that will coordinate repatriation efforts, manage relationships with origin countries, and develop educational programming around ethical archaeology." The room seemed to tilt. $50,000 was a fraction of what he might have received, but it was more money than he'd seen in years. More importantly, a full-time position, real work, purpose. "The board also accepts your proposal for a scholarship fund," Ashford continued. "We'll establish the Harold Pemberton Memorial Scholarship for students pursuing ethical archaeology and cultural heritage preservation. The university will provide matching funds." One of the board members who'd voted against the measure, a man in an expensive suit who'd argued loudest about financial implications, spoke up. "Mr. Ellison, I want you to know that while I voted differently, I respect what you've done here today. You've reminded us what this institution is supposed to stand for." Vivian was smiling broadly. Priya looked like she might cry. Even Cunningham, usually stoic, gave Mark an approving nod. "There's one more thing," Ashford said. "We'll be holding a press conference tomorrow to announce the repatriation decision. We'd like you to participate, to explain the discovery and the reasoning behind returning the collection. Representatives from Guatemala and Mexico will join us remotely." Mark found his voice, though it came out rough with emotion. "I don't know what to say, except thank you. Thank you for choosing the harder path, for honoring Harold Pemberton's wishes, for doing what's right, even when it costs something." "You gave us no choice," the stern board member said, but she was smiling. "You made the moral argument so clearly that any other decision would have been indefensible." The meeting adjourned. Board members filed out, some stopping to shake Mark's hand, others avoiding eye contact. Jake pushed through and pulled his father into a tight embrace. "You did it, Dad. You actually did it." Priya hugged him next, then Vivian. Even Cunningham shook his hand with uncharacteristic warmth. "Drinks," Vivian announced. "We're celebrating, all of us, right now." They ended up at a faculty bar near campus, a dark wood and leather place that smelled of old books and beer. The group claimed a large table: Mark, Jake, Vivian, Priya, Cunningham, and a few graduate students who'd heard the news and wanted to join. Someone ordered a round, then another. The conversation grew animated, people sharing their own stories of ethical dilemmas in archaeology, of museums slowly awakening to the implications of their collections, of the long road still ahead in making things right. Mark found himself laughing genuinely for the first time in months, maybe years. He looked around the table at these people who'd become more than colleagues. They'd become friends, allies, a community he hadn't known he needed. Later, after most people had left, Mark and Jake walked back toward the parking lot where they'd left their cars. "What happens now?" Jake asked. "Now I figure out how to actually do this job they've given me. I've never coordinated international repatriation before. I'll probably make mistakes. But you'll make them while trying to do the right thing. That counts for something." They reached Mark's old sedan, still running despite his certainty it would die any day now. Maybe he'd be able to afford a newer car soon. Not new, but newer, something reliable. "Jake," Mark said, turning to face his son, "I'm sorry I shut you out these past months. I was so focused on not being a failure that I failed at the things that actually mattered." "You're not a failure, Dad. You never were. You just needed to remember who you are." They embraced again, and Mark felt decades of distance beginning to close. The press conference the next day was surreal. Mark sat at a table with Ashford and Vivian, facing a room full of reporters and cameras. On a large screen behind them, officials from Guatemala and Mexico joined via video conference. The Guatemalan representative, a woman named Dr. Esperanza Morales, spoke with evident emotion about what these artifacts meant to her country, to the Maya communities still living near the original sites. "These are not just objects," she said. "They are ancestors. They are stories. They are connections to who we are as a people. Mr. Ellison's decision to return them is an act of healing, of recognition that our heritage has value beyond money." A reporter asked Mark the inevitable question, "Do you regret giving up potential millions?" Mark thought about his motel room, about standing at Harold Pemberton's grave, about the promise he'd made. "I found something more valuable than money," he said. "I found purpose. I found a way to connect the past to the present in meaningful ways. And I found my way back to being the person I wanted to be. You can't put a price on that." The story went viral. News outlets picked it up. Social media shared it endlessly. "Man chooses honor over fortune," read one headline. "Storage unit treasure returned to rightful owners," read another. Mark's inbox flooded with messages. Some praised his decision. Others called him foolish. A few private collectors sent angry emails accusing him of setting dangerous precedents. But there were other messages too, from archaeologists thanking him for taking a stand. From Maya community leaders expressing gratitude, from students saying his choice had inspired them to enter the field of cultural heritage preservation. One email, from an elderly woman in Guatemala, included a photograph of her grandmother, a Maya woman in traditional dress, standing near the ruins where some of the artifacts had originated. "My grandmother told stories about these sacred objects before she died," the email read. "She never thought she would see them again. Neither did I. Thank you for bringing our ancestors home." Mark read that email 3 times, then saved it in a special folder. This was why it mattered. This was what Harold Pemberton had wanted. This was what being human meant, recognizing that some things belong to everyone, that some stories are larger than individual gain, that heritage is a trust we hold for those who come after. Mark printed the email and pinned it above his new desk in his new office at the university. A reminder, for the days when this work got difficult, of why he'd chosen this path. 6 months later, Mark stood in a small village in the highlands of Guatemala, surrounded by mountains that had witnessed centuries of human history. The air was thin and cool, scented with pine and wood smoke. Around him, community members gathered in ceremonial dress, woven textiles in brilliant reds, blues and yellows, patterns passed down through generations. The repatriation ceremony was about to begin. Mark had travelled here with Vivian, Priya and Jake, who'd taken time off work to witness this moment. The journey had been long flights to Guatemala City, then a bone-rattling drive up mountain roads, but none of them had hesitated when the invitation came. The ceremonial incense burner, carefully packed and transported with every precaution, sat on a cloth-covered table near the village's small shrine. It had survived 13 centuries, survived looters and collectors, survived being forgotten in a storage unit. Now it was coming home. Don Esteban, the village elder, approached Mark with slow dignity. He was perhaps 70, his face deeply lined, his eyes bright with emotion. Through a translator, he spoke. "We heard you could have kept these things, that you could have sold them for much money. We heard you chose to return them instead." Mark felt suddenly self-conscious, aware of how inadequate his actions seemed in the face of what had been taken. They were never mine to keep. They belong here, to your community, to the people whose ancestors created them. Don Esteban placed a weathered hand on Mark's shoulder. "You have been the bridge. You carried our ancestors back to us. This is healing." The ceremony began with prayers in Quiche, the local Mayan language. Mark didn't understand the words, but he understood the reverence, the joy mixed with sorrow-joy at the return, sorrow for all the years lost. When invited, Mark helped place the incense burner in the shrine, a small stone structure that had stood for generations. The placement felt ceremonial, significant, like closing a circle that had been broken decades ago. After the formal ceremony, there was food tamales wrapped in banana leaves, fresh tortillas, chicken stewed with local herbs. The community welcomed them not as outsiders, but as honored guests. Children ran between the adults, laughing. Elders shared stories through translators, tales that referenced the very objects being returned. Mark sat with Jake, eating simple food that tasted better than any restaurant meal he'd had in years. "This is what you were meant to do," Jake said quietly. "Not cataloguing in a basement. This, connecting people to their heritage. I never imagined it would feel like this," Mark admitted. "I thought returning the artifacts would be the end. But it's really the beginning of relationships, of understanding, of something that matters beyond the objects themselves." Priya joined them, her eyes bright. "Dr. Morales told me they're planning education programs around the returned artifacts. Students from the capital will come here to learn, to understand their heritage in context rather than behind museum glass. This is how it's supposed to work." As evening fell and the celebration continued, Mark found a quiet moment to step away from the gathering. He climbed a small rise overlooking the village, watching smoke from cooking fires curl into the darkening sky. His phone buzzed surprisingly, There was signal even here. An email from Ashford. The Mexican repatriation was scheduled for next month. More artifacts going home, more ceremonies, more healing. Another email from Dennis. Saw you on the news again. You've become quite the celebrity. Don't forget us, little people. Also, you never paid me back that $100. Consider it a donation to the cause. Mark smiled and typed back. Checks in the mail. With interest. Thank you for believing in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. He looked out over the village, this small community carrying on traditions that predated nations and borders, that had survived conquest and colonization and centuries of change. They'd done it without the artifacts for decades. But having them back meant something, meant validation, meant recognition, meant the world acknowledging that their heritage mattered. The next morning, before leaving, Don Esteban presented Mark with a gift, a small obsidian mirror, polished smooth, about the size of his palm. For reflection, the elder said through the translator. So you remember this moment. So you see yourself clearly. Mark accepted it with both hands, bowing his head in thanks. On the long journey back, mountain roads, airports, finally home, Mark held the mirror carefully. It was a personal gift, not an artifact to be catalogued or authenticated. Just a reminder. Back at the university the following week, Mark settled into his office. It was small, but had a window overlooking the quad. His desk held organized stacks of correspondence with cultural ministries, planning documents for the next phase of repatriations, research proposals for collaborative projects. On the wall, he'd hung the photograph of Harold Pemberton from the 1985 magazine article. Below it, the printed email from the Guatemalan woman whose grandmother had known these artifacts. And now, on his desk, the obsidian mirror. Vivian stopped by with coffee. How was Guatemala? Perfect, Mark said simply. Exactly what it needed to be. The Mexican delegation confirmed their visit next month. You'll need to coordinate with customs, arrange secure transport, handle the diplomatic protocols. I know. I've been making lists. She smiled. You've become good at this, a natural at cultural diplomacy. I'm learning as I go. Aren't we all? She paused at the door. Mark, what you did choosing this path instead of the easy money, it's changed how people think about these issues. Other institutions are watching. Some are starting their own repatriation programs. You set something in motion. After she left, Mark sat quietly, looking at the obsidian mirror. In its dark surface, he saw his reflection, older than he'd been 6 months ago, but somehow more himself. The worry lines hadn't disappeared, but they'd changed character, transformed from anxiety into something that looked more like purpose. His phone rang. Jake. Hey, Dad. I was thinking about coming up this weekend. Maybe we could go to that Italian place again. I'd like that. I'd really like that. After they hung up, Mark returned to his work, sorting through documentation for the next round of repatriations. There was so much still to do, so many artifacts waiting to go home, so many stories waiting to be reconnected to their sources. He thought about the man who'd bid $100 borrowed dollars on a storage unit, desperate and lost, with no idea what he was about to find. That man had been searching for something to sell, some way to survive another month. Instead, he'd found a way to live. Mark picked up the obsidian mirror one more time, studied his reflection, then set it down and returned to his work. There were artifacts to return, communities to serve, promises to keep. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he knew exactly where he belonged.